it's Pastor Trish. It's Tuesday evening, and thank you for joining me as we do a psalm this evening. And this is Psalm 78. It's a fairly long psalm, and it's a historical psalm recounting both God's work, God's justice, God's faithfulness, as well as the cost of disobedience to God's will and to God's way. And so you will hear in this psalm some stories, biblical stories that I'm sure will be familiar to you. And Psalms also one of the many aspects of a psalm is to tell a story. And so, for fun, I hope you're going to enjoy this. I have this psalm as translated by the Message translation, the Message Bible, which is a very contemporary translation. And I am going to read this psalm like I'm going to tell you a story with this psalm this evening. And just remember, it's about God and God's creation and what happens when we are not faithful to God and how God responds. So here's the story. Listen, dear friends, listen to God's truth. Bend your ears to what I tell you. I'm chewing on the morsel of a proverb. I'll let you in on the sweet old truths. Stories we heard from our fathers, counsel we learned at our mother's knee. We're not keeping this to ourselves. We're passing it along to the next generation. God's fame and fortune, the marvelous things he has done. He planted a witness in Jacob, set his word firmly in Israel, then commanded our parents to teach it to their children so the next generation would know and all the generations to come know the truth and tell the stories so their children can trust in God. Never forget the works of God, but keep his commands to the letter. Heaven forbid they should be like their parents, bullheaded and bad, a fickle and faithless bunch who never stayed true to God. The Ephraimites, armed to the teeth, ran off when the battle began. They were cowards to God's covenant, refused to walk by his word. They forgot what he had done, marvels he had done right before their eyes. He performed miracles in plain sight of their parents in Egypt, out on the fields of Zoan. He split the sea and walked right through it. He piled the waters to the right and to the left. He led them by day with a cloud, led them all night long with a fiery torch. He split rocks in the wilderness, gave them all they could drink from underground springs. He made creeks flow out from sheer rock and water poured out like a river. All they did was sin even more, rebel in the desert against the high God. They tried to get their own way with God, clamored for favors, for special attention. They whined like spoiled children. Why can't God give us a decent meal in the desert? Sure, he struck the rock and the water flowed, creeks cascaded from the rock, but how about some fresh baked bread? How about a nice cut of meat? When God heard that, oh, he was furious. His anger flared against Jacob. He lost his temper with Israel. It was clear they didn't believe God, had no intention of trusting in his help. But God helped them anyway, commanded the clouds and gave orders that opened the gates of heaven. He rained down showers of manna to eat. He gave them the bread of heaven. They ate the bread of the mighty angels. He sent them all the food they could eat. He let east wind break loose from the skies, and he gave a strong push to the south wind. This time it was birds that rained down. Ooh, succulent birds, an abundance of birds. He aimed them right for the center of their camp. All around their tents there were birds. They ate and they had their fill. He handed them everything they craved on a platter. But their greed knew no bounds. They stuffed their mouths with more and more. Finally, God was fed up. His anger erupted. He cut down their brightest and best. He laid low Israel's finest young men. And can you believe it? They kept right on sinning. All these wonders, and they still wouldn't believe. So their lives dribbled off to nothing, nothing to show for their lives but a ghost town. When he cut them down, they came running for help. They turned and pled for mercy. They gave witness that God was their rock, that high God was their redeemer. But they didn't mean a word of it. They lied through their teeth the whole time. They could not have cared less about him, wanted nothing to do with his covenant. And God, compassionate, forgave their sin, didn't destroy. Over and over he reined in his anger, restrained his considerable wrath. He knew what they were made of. He knew there wasn't much to them. How often in the desert they had spurned him, tried his patience in those wilderness years. Time and again they pushed him to the limit, provoked Israel's holy God. How quickly they forgot what he'd done, forgot their day of rescue from the enemy when he did those miracles in Egypt, wonders on the plain of Zoan. He turned the river and its streams to blood, not a drop of water fit to drink. He sent flies which ate them alive and frogs which bedeviled them. He turned their harvest over to caterpillars, everything they had worked for to the locusts. He flattened their grapevines with hail, a killing frost ruined their orchards. He pounded their cattle with hail, let thunderbolts loose on the wind. His anger flared, a wild firestorm of havoc, an advance guard of disease-carrying angels to clear the ground, preparing the way before him. He didn't spare those people. He let the plague rage through their lives. He killed all the Egyptian firstborns, lusty infants, offspring of Ham's vitality. Then he led his people out like sheep, took his flock safely through the wilderness. He took good care of them. They had nothing to fear. The sea took care of their enemies for good. He brought them into his holy land. This mountain he claimed for his own. He scattered everyone who got in their way. He staked out an inheritance for them. The tribes of Israel all had their own places. But they kept on giving him a hard time, rebelled against God, the high God, refused to do anything he told them. They were worse, if that's possible, than their parents, traitors, crooked as a corkscrew. Their pagan orgies provoked God's anger. Their obscene idolatries broke his heart. When God heard their carryings on, he was furious. He posted a huge no over Israel. He walked off and left Shiloh empty, abandoned the shrine where he had met with Israel. He let his pride and joy go to the dogs, turned his back on the pride of his life. He turned them loose on the fields of battle. Angry, he let them fend for themselves. Their young men went to war and never came back. Their young women waited in vain. Their priests were massacred, and their widows never shed a tear. Suddenly, the Lord was up on his feet like someone roused from deep sleep, shouting like a drunken warrior. He hit his enemies hard, sent them running, yelping, not daring to look back. He disqualified Joseph as leader, told Ephraim he didn't have what it takes, and chose the tribe of Judah instead, Mount Zion, which he loved so much. He built a sanctuary there, resplendent, solid, and lasting as the earth itself. And then he chose David, his servant, handpicked him from his work in the sheep pens. One day he was caring for the ewes and their lambs. The next day, God had him shepherding Jacob, his people Israel, his prized possession. His good heart made him a good shepherd. He guided the people wisely and well. Psalm 78. Have a good evening. See you on Thursday.